Have you ever found yourself in a season of waiting, like where the heavens seem like brass, and you just decide that maybe God needs a little bit of your help to bring his promises to pass?
Oh, that is such a familiar human reaction. We hit a wall and we panic.
Right. You look at your life, you see a glaring deficit, and you grab onto whatever pragmatic worldly tool is within reach. You become convinced that you can speed up the Almighty.
Yeah, you essentially decide to force his hand.
Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. I am thrilled you are joining us today. We're bringing you a brand new deep dive into Genesis chapter 30.
Specifically, we are going to be looking at verses 14 through 24 today.
Yes, and we are using two incredibly thorough theological commentaries as our guides for this. Our mission for this deep dive is very clear. We're going to analyze the glaring contrast between human pragmatism and divine sovereignty.
That is the core tension of this entire passage.
It really is. We want to look closely at how the Lord's immutable decree overrules the messy, sinful scheming of his people to build his church. Okay, let's unpack this. If you look at the landscape of modern Christianity, we are utterly obsessed with methods.
Oh, for sure. Methods, strategies, shortcuts, you name it.
Right. But when we open the book of Genesis, we collide with a narrative that just shatters all of our manufactured timelines.
That scenario you just painted captures the stark reality of this text perfectly. What stands out immediately in these verses is the sheer, unvarnished realism of the biblical record.
It is shockingly raw.
It is. Moses, writing under the inspiration of the Holy Spirit, does not present the patriarchs or their wives as moral superheroes.
No, they're definitely not flawless figures standing on a pedestal for us to idolize.
Not at all. Instead, they are intensely flawed individuals who are rescued entirely by sovereign grace. When you read Genesis 30, you see a household suffocating under the weight of envy, jealousy, and blatant manipulation.
It reads like a tragedy, honestly.
It does. Yet right in the middle of that domestic chaos, we see the steadfast character of God. He works through the mess. And I want to be clear here. He does this not because he approves of their scheming, but because he made a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
So his grace operates independently of their moral performance.
Absolutely. It demonstrates that salvation belongs to the Lord alone. The raw historical account forces the reader to confront the absolute necessity of divine intervention.
I'm so glad you brought up the sheer realism of the text.
Yeah.
Because we cannot just parachute into the wheat harvest in Genesis 30 without surveying the absolute wreckage of Genesis 29.
Oh, without a doubt, the backstory is critical here.
Right. You cannot understand the motivations driving these characters without it. So Jacob worked 7 years for his uncle Laban, and this was to marry Rachel, the woman he loved.
Yes. And the text gives us that beautiful detail that those years seemed to him like just a few days.
Simply because of the love he had for her. But then Laban pulls off this massive deception.
He does. Under the cover of darkness, he uses the heavy bridal veils and the cultural customs of the ancient Near East to trick him.
Right. He substitutes his older daughter Leah into the marriage bed. I mean, think about waking up the next morning. Jacob realizes he's been tricked.
It is a devastating betrayal, and then he is forced to agree to another 7 years of grueling labor, all just to finally marry Rachel.
The text is brutally honest about the fallout from this. It states plainly that Jacob loved Rachel more than Leah.
Yeah, so you have a household built on deceit, explicit favoritism, and massive heartbreak.
Can you imagine the physical reality of this? They're living in tents separated by mere yards. Leah knows her husband prefers the woman in the tent next door.
And Rachel knows her sister occupies a legal and physical space she deeply resents.
The emotional devastation in that encampment must have been staggering.
It was. The context of Laban's deception creates a permanent bleeding fracture in the family structure. Jacob was a victim of Laban's trickery, yes, but Jacob also actively perpetuated the dysfunction.
By harboring and displaying such overt favoritism, right?
Precisely. He failed to protect the dignity of Leah. And this brings us to the programmatic statement of Genesis 29, verse 31.
What does that verse tell us?
The text says that when the Lord saw that Leah was unloved, or hated, as some literal translations render the Hebrew idiom, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren.
Wow. So that is a severe sovereign reversal of expectations.
It is. God steps into the asymmetry of human affection and introduces an asymmetry of fruitfulness. Leah possesses biological fruitfulness without marital affection. Rachel possesses intense marital affection without biological fruitfulness.
God establishes a paradigm where neither woman has everything, and both women are driven to absolute desperation.
That is a great way to summarize it.
I was looking at that specific phrase. He opened her womb. In our highly medicalized 21st century society, We tend to view fertility as a strictly biological or clinical process.
We really do. We immediately think in scientific terms.
Right. If someone struggles with infertility today, the immediate response is to seek a medical specialist. But in the context of the book of Genesis, we are dealing with something vastly larger than biology, aren't we?
Yes, we are. The womb in the patriarchal narratives carries a massive theological weight.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. We must view this entire conflict through the lens of the Abrahamic promise. This was established back in Genesis 12 and reaffirmed in Genesis 15 and 17.
Right, where God swore a covenant oath to Abraham.
Yes. He promised that Abraham would become a great nation, that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore, and most significantly, that through his seed, all the families of the earth would be blessed.
And this traces all the way back to Genesis 3, doesn't it?
It does. It goes back to the proto-evangelium in Genesis 3.15. That is the promise that the seed of the woman would crush the head of the serpent. Therefore, in these narratives, fertility is highly theological.
Because every single birth contributes to the redemptive historical line.
Absolutely. The promised seed, the coming Messiah, is at stake. When we see barrenness, first with Sarah, then with Rebekah, and now with Rachel, it creates massive covenantal tension.
It forces the ancient reader to pause.
It forces all of us to realize that the promised seed comes not by ordinary human biology or natural capacity. It comes by direct, supernatural, divine intervention.
So God systematically closes the wombs of the matriarchs to prove a point.
He does it to prove that the existence of Israel is a miraculous work of grace, not a product of human virility.
That raises a really difficult question, though. I mean, I understand the theological necessity of proving that the nation is born of a miracle. But John Calvin, in his commentaries on this passage, points out that this specific setup breeds what he calls perverse emulation.
That is such an accurate description of their behavior.
It really is. The sisters are looking at each other, comparing their blessings, and entering into an outright, vicious war for supremacy. They are literally using their handmaids, Bilhah and Zilpah, as proxy wives.
Just to generate more children to tally up points against each other.
Right. So why would God use this specific, highly volatile method? Why choose such a dysfunctional family to build the nation of Israel? It seems almost reckless.
It does look reckless from a human perspective.
If he is the sovereign God orchestrating the lineage of the Messiah, he could have chosen a family that modeled perfect, harmonious piety. He could have chosen a monogamous, loving couple who patiently waited on the Lord. Why use a household that feels like a toxic, ancient reality show?
That is a question that strikes at the very heart of how God chooses to operate in a fallen world. He certainly could have manufactured a pristine family unit, but God's methods are purposefully designed to ensure that the glory goes entirely to the Creator, not the creature.
That makes a lot of sense.
Think about it. If Israel had been founded by a family of perfect moral standing, devoid of conflict or sin, humanity would inevitably attribute the success of the covenant to human righteousness.
We would look at Jacob, Leah, and Rachel and deduce that they earned their place in redemptive history through their pristine behavior.
We would conclude that God chose them because they were inherently better than the Canaanites around them.
But they were not better.
Not at all. By choosing a family fracturing under the weight of its own sin, God highlights the sheer might of his divine grace. Human frailty becomes the dark velvet backdrop against which the brilliant diamond of God's sovereignty is displayed.
The nation springs from brokenness, deceit, and jealousy, so that it is undeniable that God and God alone built the house.
It absolutely shatters any human boasting.
So God is essentially preempting the self-righteousness of the future nation of Israel by recording the scandalous reality of their origins. That is fascinating.
It is a brilliant display of his wisdom.
Well, this desperation, this toxic rivalry over the covenant seed and marital affection, drives the sisters to seek worldly solutions. The friction in the household reaches a boiling point.
And that brings us right to the famous incident during the wheat harvest, covered in verses 14 through 16.
Yes. The text tells us that during the days of the wheat harvest, Leah's eldest son, Reuben, goes out into the field and finds mandrakes. He brings them to his mother, and Rachel, who has been watching, immediately demands them.
She wastes no time.
I was looking at the Hebrew for these mandrakes, the dudam, and it threw me for a loop. It shares a root with the Hebrew word for love, right?
You are hitting on the exact linguistic connection there.
So Rachel isn't just asking for a snack or a pretty flower here, is she? It feels like she's grasping for a potion. What is the historical and botanical reality of what Reuben actually pulled out of the dirt?
Well, the Hebrew word used here is dudam. If we look at the etymology, didam shares a root with the Hebrew word for love, which is dod.
God. Okay.
Consequently, these plants were often called love apples in antiquity. Botanically speaking, the mandrake is a perennial plant native to the Mediterranean region. It belongs to the nightshade family.
So it actually contains psychoactive alkaloids.
Yes, it does. But the most significant factor for the ancient mind was the shape of its root. The mandrake root often bifurcates. It bears a striking resemblance to the lower half of a human body.
Oh, wow. I could see how that would lead to some wild assumptions.
It did. In the ancient Near East, this visual similarity fueled widespread superstitious beliefs in sympathetic magic. Because the root looked like human reproductive organs, pagan cultures coveted them as potent aphrodisiacs and mystical fertility narcotics.
People actually believed that consuming this plant could magically cure barrenness.
Consuming it or even just placing it near the marital bed, yes. They believed it could induce conception. So when Rachel sees Reuben carrying these plants, she recognizes their cultural value immediately.
She's not asking for a dietary supplement.
No. She is making a conscious turn toward pagan superstition. She is grasping for a pharmacological and mystical shortcut to achieve what only God can grant.
She is essentially abandoning the covenant promises of God. She is ignoring the theology of her own family line and resorting to localized witchcraft and Canaanite folklore.
The desperation is so severe that she is willing to try sympathetic magic.
And Leah's response to this request is incredibly bitter. Leah says, "Is it a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you take away my son's mandrakes also?"
It is a devastating look into Leah's lingering pain.
The resulting bargain is tragic. Rachel wants the magic roots so badly that she trades her marital bed for them. She tells Leah that Jacob can sleep with her that night in exchange for the plants.
It really is a horrific scene.
Later that evening, Leah goes out to meet Jacob as he is coming in from the fields, exhausted from the harvest. And she blatantly tells him, "You must come in to me, for I have hired you with my son's mandrakes." The commodification of the marriage bed here is awful. Jacob is treated like a farm implement.
It is a severe distortion of the marital union God instituted in Eden. Marriage, intimacy, and the hope of children are reduced to transactional, cutthroat bargaining.
The husband is treated as property.
Like a day laborer to be rented out for the price of hallucinogenic roots. Jacob has completely lost control of his own household. He is passively traded between his wives. The dignity of the covenant family is dragged through the mud of jealousy and pragmatic exchange.
You mentioned analyzing the syntax of this passage earlier.
Yes, if you look at the syntax, you see the active Hebrew verbs piling up rapidly. Reuben went, he found, he brought, Rachel said. Leah answered. Leah went out and hired.
The subjects of all these sentences are frantic, striving humans.
Precisely. God is entirely absent from their calculations in these verses. It is a house built entirely on fleshly effort, exposing the massive idol of control that dominates both of these women.
They believe that if they just pull the right levers, they can force reality to conform to their desires.
And they think making the right trades and consuming the right plants will fix everything.
Here is where it gets really interesting for us today. It is incredibly easy to look back thousands of years, read about two sisters fighting over a root shaped like a pair of legs, and judge Rachel for wanting magic plants.
Oh, it is very easy to feel superior to them.
We can feel very intellectually superior to these ancient nomads. But we have to bring this into the present day. We have to look in the mirror. I think these mandrakes are the absolute perfect analogy for modern evangelical pragmatism.
I agree completely. It is a brilliant parallel.
Think about the massive seeker-sensitive movement or the prosperity gospel that plagues so many modern churches.
Right.
Are we trading the pure means of grace, the preaching of the word, the administration of the sacraments, and corporate prayer for modern marketing techniques?
We absolutely are. We trade them for algorithmic growth strategies and psychological gimmicks to manufacture spiritual growth.
Are we using our own version of modern mandrakes to build a massive crowd, rather than trusting the Holy Spirit to regenerate hearts and build a genuine church?
That analogy is spot on, because the flesh always seeks a tangible shortcut. The flesh hates waiting on the invisible work of the Spirit.
It wants immediate visible results.
Exactly. Wait, let me rephrase that. You are 100% right. In the modern church, the underlying philosophy driving so much of what we do is often that if we can just figure out the right sociological technique, we can force God's hand.
The right stage lighting, the right musical emotional manipulation.
Or the right 5-step self-help sermon series. We try to manufacture spiritual fruitfulness through human ingenuity. We bypass the Creator to find hope in the creation.
Rachel believed the mandrakes would give her a child.
And today, pastors and church boards often believe that adopting secular corporate strategies, demographic targeting, and entertainment-driven worship will give them a thriving, fruitful congregation.
Both of these approaches are forms of functional atheism, aren't they?
They are. They operate on the assumption that God is either unwilling or unable to act through his prescribed means. So we decide we must seize control, manipulate the variables, and produce the outcome ourselves.
We trade the solemnity of the covenant for the pragmatism of the marketplace.
Functional atheism within the covenant community.
That is a chilling diagnosis. But it is entirely accurate. We act like spiritual orphans trying to survive on our own wits. We scramble for whatever root we can pull out of the secular dirt, rather than resting as children of a sovereign king.
It is a tragic way to live.
And the listener might assume, reading the very next verse in Genesis 30, that Leah's fleshly bartering actually worked. This brings us to verses 17 through 21, looking at transactional religion and the bitter harvest.
This is a crucial section to analyze carefully.
Verse 17 says, "And God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son." If we stop reading there, we might walk away with a terrible, catastrophic theological misunderstanding.
We really might.
We might look at her hiring of Jacob, see the resulting pregnancy, and conclude that God rewarded her scheming.
That is a critical juncture in the text, and it requires careful theological precision. God does listen to Leah, and she bears Issachar and later Zebulun, and eventually a daughter named Dinah.
But we must be exceptionally careful not to fall into moralism here.
Or a primitive prosperity gospel mindset. Leah herself makes this terrible theological blunder. In verse 18, after Issachar is born, she says, "God has given me my wages because I gave my servant to my husband."
Listen to her vocabulary there.
She explicitly views the child as a paycheck. She believes she successfully hired God's favor through her manipulative bartering and her prior decision to give her handmaid Zilpah to Jacob.
She frames divine blessing as a strict transaction.
She thinks she manipulated the system, paid the right price, and extracted the desired product from the heavens. She interprets the providence of God as an endorsement of her sin.
Hold on. This is where I need to push back a bit, or at least ask for serious clarification for our listeners.
Please do.
If God's decree governed her transactional manipulation, and he gave her a son right after she engaged in this sinful bartering, doesn't that make God the author of her sin? Or at the very least, isn't he validating her terrible theology by giving her what she paid for?
Those are the natural questions that arise.
We adhere to the Westminster Confession, which states that God ordains whatsoever comes to pass. How does that confessional standard rescue us from Leah's terrible theology without making God the author of her moral failure?
That is the essential question of Reformed theology, and we have to separate God's perceptive will from his decretive will to understand it.
Let's break those terms down.
Let me offer an analogy. Think of God's perceptive will like the speed limit signs on a highway. It is his moral command, his revealed law detailing what we ought to do. Leah blatantly broke the speed limit.
Her envy, her commodification of her husband, her reliance on superstition.
All of those things violated God's perceptive will, but God's decretive will is the actual engine of the universe. It is the sovereign, immutable blueprint of what will actually happen in history.
So God used her speeding, her sinful choices, to get the vehicle exactly where he had eternally decreed it must go.
Yes. The Westminster Confession of Faith, chapter 5, states that God, the great creator of all things, does uphold, direct, dispose, and govern all creatures' actions and things, from the greatest even to the least, by his most wise and holy providence.
It covers absolutely everything.
Crucially, it adds that he does this according to his infallible foreknowledge and the free and immutable counsel of his own will. Yet so as thereby neither is God the author of sin, nor is violence offered to the will of the creatures.
So Leah was acting entirely out of her own sinful free agency. Nobody forced her to trade for the mandrakes or hire Jacob.
Nobody put a gun to her head.
She did that because she wanted to. But God, in his infinite wisdom, was superintending those sinful choices to accomplish his holy purpose of building the 12 tribes of Israel.
Spot on. God listening to Leah does not equal God endorsing her hiring scheme. He blessed her because he was committed to the Abrahamic covenant, not because her bartering impressed him.
He brought about the birth of Issachar and Zebulun despite her sin, not as a reward for it.
We are explicitly rejecting the tenets of Arminianism and legalism here.
Let's contrast those for the listener.
Arminianism suggests that God is essentially reacting to human choices, looking down the corridors of time, waiting to see what we will do before he makes his move.
And legalism tells us that if we perform well enough, we obligate God to bless us.
Right. If we gather enough mandrakes or do enough good deeds, God owes us. Both systems place human initiative at the dead center of the universe. The world constantly repeats the phrase, God helps those who help themselves.
But the Reformed faith declares something entirely different.
The Reformed faith declares that God helps the helpless. God helps those who are dead in their trespasses and sins. His favor is never a reaction to our initiative.
If God's grace were just a reaction to our initiative, we would be entirely without hope, because our initiative is always tainted by self-interest and sin. Leah's initiative was rooted in jealousy and a burning desire to dominate her sister.
If God only blessed pure, untainted human initiative, the wombs in that tent would have remained permanently closed.
God's grace is sovereign, meaning it is unmerited, unprompted, and unstoppable. It flows solely from his own good pleasure. I want to speak directly to you, the listener, right now.
This is a crucial application.
Think about your own prayer life. Think about your own approach to obedience in your daily walk. Are you treating God like a cosmic vending machine?
That is a piercing question.
Are you attempting to hire his favor with your good behavior, your flawless church attendance, your generous tithing, or your precise theological knowledge? Do you secretly harbor the belief that because you did all the right things, God is legally obligated to give you a comfortable life?
Or a healthy family or a successful career?
Leah's theology of wages is a subtle poison that infects so many of our hearts today. We have to recognize that every single blessing we have is a gift of staggering grace, not a paycheck for our performance.
That is the essence of the bitter harvest of human scheming. Leah gets the children, but her heart remains entirely restless.
Look at her statement when Zebulun is born in verse 20.
She says, "Now my husband will honor me, because I have borne him 6 sons." She has 6 sons, the bulk of the future nation of Israel, but she is still chasing the idol of Jacob's affection.
She is still empty inside.
The mandrakes, the bartering, and even the children could never satisfy the deepest longings of her soul. And what about Rachel? All the striving, all the superstitious mandrakes, the renting out of her husband, leave Rachel completely empty.
The narrative lets the sheer futility of the flesh hang in the air for years.
The mandrakes failed. The human manipulation failed. The story only resolves when the sentence structure itself changes.
What's fascinating here is the massive syntactic shift in verse 22. This is the turning point of the entire narrative, the moment the dark clouds finally break.
Yeah, it's my favorite part of the chapter.
After 14 verses of frantic human striving, of women trading and hiring and fighting, God abruptly becomes the subject of the main clause. The text says, "Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb."
The camera violently pans away from the muddy, chaotic tent of human striving and points directly at the throne of heaven.
It is a stunning shift.
Moses masterfully uses grammar to teach theology here. Up to this point, humans were the subject of all the verbs. Now, God acts, God remembers, God listens, God opens.
Let's talk about the verb translated as remembered.
It is the Hebrew word Issachar. We need to clarify what divine remembrance entails because we naturally project our human limitations onto God.
When the Bible says God remembers, it is not suggesting a memory lapse.
It does not mean God was distracted by running the distant galaxies, suddenly slapped his forehead and said, "Oh no, I forgot about Rachel down in Paddan-Aram."
That would be absurd.
Divine remembrance in Scripture is a technical covenantal term. It signals the arrival of the fullness of time for God to act upon his immutable decree in covenant mercy.
It means he is moving from the passive phase of his providence into active, saving intervention.
Yes.
We see that same word, Zachar, used with Noah, right? The floodwaters are covering the earth. The entire world has been destroyed. Noah is stuck in the ark for months. And then the text in Genesis 8 says, "But God remembered Noah, and the waters begin to recede."
That is a perfect biblical cross-reference. God didn't forget Noah was floating around in a wooden box. It was simply the appointed, decreed time for deliverance to commence.
We see it again in the book of Exodus.
We do. The Israelites groan in their brutal slavery in Egypt for 400 years, and God hears their groaning, and Exodus 2.24 says God remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob.
He didn't lose the covenant document in a filing cabinet somewhere.
No. He was deciding, according to the counsel of his own will, that the specific generation had arrived. The cup of the Amorites was full, and the moment had come to crush Pharaoh and deliver his people.
So when God remembers Rachel in Genesis 30, he is initiating his saving action based on his prior promises.
He steps into her affliction, not as a reaction to the mandrakes, but in accordance with his perfect, predetermined timing.
Let's talk about the utter irrelevance of those mandrakes for a moment, because the irony is staggering. Rachel traded her husband for these magical fertility roots in verse 15. She likely consumed them or performed whatever ritual was required, hoping for an immediate magical pregnancy.
But verses 17 through 21 detail the subsequent births of Leah's fifth son, her sixth son, and a daughter.
Years are passing. Entire gestational periods are coming and going. The mystical plants did absolutely nothing. They were a complete humiliating failure.
When the text finally says God opened Rachel's womb, it is a glaring indictment of her prior pagan pragmatism.
God alone possessed the authority to grant life, and he waited until the absolute uselessness of her methods was exposed.
The irrelevance of the mandrakes exposes the total bankruptcy of all our worldly idols. The things we turn to instead of God always overpromise and severely underdeliver.
Rachel put her highest hope in a root pulled from the dirt, and it left her barren, humiliated, and alienated from her husband for years.
When God finally intervenes, he does not just give her a biological child, he removes her profound humiliation.
Wait, I said profound. Let me correct myself. He removes her massive humiliation.
Good catch. Rachel conceives, gives birth to a son, and declares, God has taken away my reproach. She names the boy Joseph.
We must understand the intense social and emotional shame of barrenness in the ancient Near East to grasp the weight of this moment.
A woman's entire social standing, her economic security in old age, her standing among the other wives and servants, and her value in the eyes of the culture were intimately tied to producing male heirs.
To be barren was to be viewed as cursed by the gods. It was a mark of public shame.
It is a striking example of how divine mercy reaches into our most acute, specific pain. Rachel was carrying a burden of public shame and private agony that we can barely comprehend.
She lived in a tent where his sister was popping out boys like a factory, where her own servants were having children on her knees while she suffered in silent, empty grief.
When God acts, he restores her dignity. He publicly vindicates her. He removes her reproach entirely.
This completely refutes the error of open theism, doesn't it?
It shatters it completely.
Open theism argues that God doesn't know the future exhaustively. It claims he is just reacting and adapting to our choices as we go. It portrays God as a cosmic chess player who is really good at reacting to our moves, but doesn't actually control the board.
Open theism is a severe distortion of the biblical God. It reduces the Almighty to a highly intelligent reactionary.
If open theism were true, God was just waiting around for Rachel to finally get her heart right.
Or perhaps he was just as surprised as anyone else when the biological variables finally aligned and she conceived.
But classic Reformed theology defends a God who declares the end from the beginning.
God was not reacting to Rachel's eventual surrender. He had decreed from eternity past that Joseph would be born precisely at this historical moment to this specific mother after a long period of agonizing barrenness to accomplish a massive redemptive purpose.
He purposefully closed her womb for a season to break her reliance on the flesh, and he opened it at the appointed hour to demonstrate his strength.
He acted entirely according to the counsel of his own will, demonstrating his absolute sovereignty over every microscopic detail of human history.
Wait, so God finally gives Rachel a son. But why Joseph? Why go through decades of domestic warfare, delayed timelines, and agonizing barrenness just to produce this specific boy?
Yeah.
Where is this all heading historically?
This leads us right into the redemptive, historical, and Christological implications of our deep dive.
When we read these narratives about Jacob's multiple wives, proxy servants, and concubines, we have to maintain clear, systematic theological boundaries, right? People read this and get very confused about biblical ethics.
We absolutely must maintain those boundaries. It is vital that we distinguish between Israel as a developing national entity and the New Testament church.
The polygamous dysfunction of the patriarchs is descriptive, not prescriptive.
It is not a template for Christian marriage. Christian marriage, as established in creation in Genesis 2 and reaffirmed by Christ in Matthew 19 and the apostles in Ephesians 5, is complementarian and strictly monogamous. One man and one woman for life.
So the text in Genesis 30 is not endorsing Jacob's chaotic household structure.
Rather, it is providing a historical record of God building a physical nation out of fallen, sinful material. God is establishing the 12 tribes of Israel, the physical lineage through which the Messiah will eventually come. And he is doing it despite the massive moral failings of the people involved.
But this historical record points directly to Jesus. Let's trace this line for the listener.
Joseph is born. He is the highly favored son of his father.
What happens to Joseph later in the book of Genesis? He is hated by his brothers without cause. He is stripped of his royal robe. He is sold for 20 pieces of silver.
He is falsely accused by Potiphar's wife. He is thrown into a dungeon, descending into the pit, seemingly forgotten.
But then God raises him up. He is exalted to the right hand of Pharaoh, given all authority over the kingdom, and he becomes the savior of the known world by providing the bread of life during a global famine.
Crucially, he saves the very brothers who betrayed him and sold him into slavery. Joseph is a massive, towering, historical type of Christ.
The parallels are undeniable and magnificent. Joseph is a historical foreshadowing of the Lord Jesus Christ.
Just as Joseph was beloved by the Father, despised by his brethren, sold for silver, falsely condemned among criminals, and subsequently exalted to the highest place of authority to grant life to a starving world, so too was Jesus.
And notice how Joseph's birth required miraculous divine intervention. The womb was closed, human striving completely failed, the pagan mandrakes were useless. God had to supernaturally open the womb for this savior figure to be born.
This proves historically that the ultimate promised seed, Jesus Christ, would not be born of the will of the flesh, nor of human striving, nor of pragmatic bartering, but by the miraculous intervention of God through the virgin birth.
The entire narrative of Genesis 30 is a neon sign pointing toward the incarnation.
It really is.
The ultimate seed is Jesus. If we synthesize this entire discussion, we're staring at a massive law-gospel contrast. The law shows us that our fleshly schemes, our desperate bartering, our reliance on worldly mandrakes, our attempts to hire God are completely barren.
The law demands perfect, flawless obedience, which Leah and Rachel and you and I fail to produce.
We bring our pathetic, sin-stained wages to God, expecting a reward, and the law exposes our wages as filthy rags. We are bankrupt. But the gospel shows us that Christ paid the wages we could never afford.
Christ lived the perfect life we failed to live. He suffered the wrath we deserved. He purchased the bride with his own precious blood, not with superstitious mandrakes.
That is the very heart of Reformed theology. We are bankrupt beggars who have absolutely nothing to offer God, yet we are freely given the boundless riches of Christ's perfect righteousness.
Leah thought she had to hire Jacob's affection through exhausting manipulation. How tragic.
But the church does not have to hire Christ's affection. We did not have to barter for his love. He gave himself up for her freely to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word.
The transition from the muddy chaos of Padan Aram to the finished, atoning work of Golgotha is the core of our hope. God's covenant purposes never fail because they do not rest on the shaky foundation of our performance. They rest entirely on the broad shoulders of the Son of God.
We have covered incredible theological ground today, looking at everything from ancient botany to the decrees of God. But we must move from the ancient tenets of Padan Aram into your daily life.
Application is essential.
We want to look at the application of this text across 3 domains: head, heart, and hands. Let's start with the head. We need right doctrine. What is the intellectual challenge this text issues to the listener right now?
The intellectual challenge to the head is to totally radically reject modern functional atheism.
We live in a secular culture that incessantly tells us to manifest our own destinies.
The world tells you that your future is entirely in your hands, that if you visualize it, work hard enough, hustle constantly, and manipulate your circumstances, you can bend reality to your will.
You can be the God of your own life.
This text shatters that illusion into 1,000 pieces. We must stop trying to manifest our destinies and instead trust the Creator's immutable decree. We must acknowledge that our times are in His hands.
Recognizing God's absolute sovereignty over our circumstances is the fundamental requirement for true peace.
If you believe you are the captain of your soul, you will live in perpetual anxiety, always calculating, always striving, always bargaining, always terrified that you didn't pull the right lever. Right doctrine frees the mind to rest in the sovereignty of a good Father.
Rest is precisely what the heart needs. I want to speak directly to the listener who feels forgotten today. The person listening right now who feels like they are stranded in verse 15, surrounded by unanswered prayers.
There are so many people in that exact place.
Maybe you are a single person aching for a spouse, and you see everyone around you getting married. You see their social media posts, and you feel the bitter, agonizing sting of envy.
Or maybe you are a couple mourning the severe pain of infertility, crying out to God month after month, surrounded by baby showers you can barely stand to attend.
Or perhaps you are a pastor or a church worker laboring in a dry, barren ministry, watching the pragmatic, entertainment-driven church down the street explode in growth while you struggle to keep the doors open and preach the word faithfully.
The message for your heart today is this: you do not need manipulative tactics. You do not need to grab for worldly mandrakes. God remembers his own in his perfect timing.
The phrase, "God remembered Rachel," is a potent balm for the weary soul. The Lord sees your tears. He knows your longings intimately. He has not turned his back on you, and he has not forgotten your address.
The delay you are experiencing is not a sign of his absence, his anger, or his impotence. It is a calculated component of his sovereign timing.
Yeah.
He is doing something in the waiting that cannot be accomplished in the receiving.
When we grasp this, it changes our hands, our daily actions. This brings us to the third use of the law.
In Reformed theology, the third use of the law guides the believer in living a life of gratitude. Because we know God is sovereign and because we know Christ has already secured our salvation entirely, we do not obey God in order to hire him.
We do not do good works to put God in our debt or bribe him for a blessing.
We obey because we have been bought by the precious blood of Christ. Our obedience is a joyful, liberated response to grace, not a fearful, exhausting negotiation for wages.
I love drawing an analogy here to the communion table, to the Lord's Supper. When we gather as a church on the Lord's Day to take the Lord's Supper, we are physically acting out this theology.
It is a beautiful picture.
We do not approach the table bringing our mandrakes to barter. We don't bring our impressive resumes, our tithing records, our moral superiority, or our flawless theology to trade for the bread and the wine.
If we try to negotiate at the table, we eat and drink judgment upon ourselves.
We come to the table as beggars, with completely empty hands, receiving the bread of life. We receive the body and blood of Christ freely given. The meal is a weekly declaration that the striving is over, the hiring is finished, the price has been paid in full by someone else.
It is a brilliant integration of worship and systematic theology. The table requires us to lay down our fleshly schemes. Jacob's household was fractured by a relentless, cutthroat competition to secure value and status. Leah and Rachel were destroying each other to prove their worth.
But the gospel levels all of us at the foot of the cross.
Whether you relate more to the unloved, rejected Leah or the barren, desperate Rachel, your only hope is the unmerited favor of the God who remembers his covenant. We abandon our pragmatic tools, we drop our superstitious idols, and we rest entirely in the sufficiency of Christ's perfect sacrifice.
As we wrap up this deep dive, we look back at the chaotic narrative of Genesis 30. We have seen a household torn apart by envy, favoritism, and human pragmatism. We have seen the folly of trusting in mandrakes and the bitter, exhausting harvest of transactional religion.
But high above the fray of the patriarchs, we have seen the majestic, sovereign grace of God, who builds his church according to his own perfect will, using broken people to accomplish holy ends.
This text shatters our reliance on our own cleverness and forces us to rest in the finished work of Christ.
It forces us to acknowledge, with total submission, that salvation belongs to the Lord. From the opening of a barren womb in an ancient dusty tent to the glorious resurrection of Jesus Christ from a borrowed tomb, God delights in bringing life out of death, proving that his strength is made perfect in our weakness. He gets all the glory and we get all the grace.
I want to leave you with a final lingering question to mull over as you go about your day. Think about the mandrake you are holding on to right now. What is that worldly method, that pragmatic tool, or that transactional mindset you think will force God's hand in your life? What are you trusting in besides the finished work of Jesus? What would happen tomorrow if you simply dropped it, stepped back, and waited on the Lord? May you find the grace to rest completely in the finished work of Christ. Thank you for joining us on Reformed Thinking.